Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And friends, this week we are in Haftarat Toldot. And this Haftarat begins in Malachi, Perech Aleph until Perech Bet Pasuk Zayin, or the book of Malachi, chapter 1, verse 1, until chapter 2, verse 7. It reads, Ma'aseh davar Adonai el Yisrael biyad Malachi. The prophetic burden of the word of Hashem through Malachi. Pasuk Bet. Ahavti etchem amar Adonai, ve'amartem bama achavtanu, halo ach Esav, le'Yaakov neum Adonai, va'ohav et Yaakov. I love you, said Hashem, and you said, how have you loved us?
So here we have Israel responding in the collective. Remember, it's not just Yaakov, the person. Okay, reading on.
Was not Esav a brother of Yaakov? But Hashem says, yet I loved Yaakov. Pasuk Gimel. Ve'et Esav saneti ve'asim et harav shemama ve'et nechalato letanot midbar. But I hated Esav. I made his mountains a desolation and his legacy the desert serpents. So this pasuk really is one that lays the foundation for much that is taught nowadays in the Kabbalistic Jewish world today. What do I mean? Well, it is this pasuk here that many use to justify the idea of intrinsic worth, explained through intrinsic hatred. In other words, many teach because it states that Hashem hated Esav and loved Yaakov, that this in some way shows a bit of favoritism in God's part towards Israel, who is originally Yaakov, and almost an unfair bias towards Esav, and all this in one pasuk. And this, at least for those of us who are big advocates of not just ethical monotheism, but of de-ethnicizing Judaism, believe that this, if understood incorrectly, really throws a wrench into our whole hashkafa. And friends, the truth is that this pasuk, ethically, is not a problem at all. How? Because this here is not speaking about Esav the individual, but what eventually will become of his line and his descendants. And the key is found here.
Like we mentioned earlier, when it mentioned Yaakov, but it was really referring to Israel as a whole.
In other words, in the fourth pasuk, in pasuk Dalet, it states, Ki to'amar Edom, rushashnu v'nashuv, v'nivnecha rachot, ko amar Adonai Sevaot. Again, teaching us that this here is talking about Esav in the collective and not Esav the individual. Now, one can then say that it may have encompassed the collective through the individual. And honestly, that could also be possible. But the problem then arises on how do we take an individual such as Esav, who, at least according to the pashat of the narrative, is not a bad guy, and then paint him into someone that these words could possibly stick to, which is an approach that some rabbis have taken throughout the ages. An approach and understanding that, although I would think was not popular in Mishnaic times, certainly is an approach that has become a popular one today, which is the attempt to defame the character of Esav. And honestly, what did Esav actually do wrong according to the narrative? I mean, I know that many rabbis huff and puff to make Esav seem like not just an animal, but a wicked son as well. But friends, the truth is that, like I said, at least according to the Pashat, this is not the case. And it really ultimately boils down to a silly idea floating around in the Jewish world known as yichus, or pedigree, which is usually understood and expressed as people either justifying what you have done in your life or what you're going to do based on what line you descend from. In this case, regarding Esav, it's almost expressed as a reversed form of yichus. In other words, because Esav's descendants became immoral pagans, this in some way means that Esav must have been spiritually tainted from the beginning. Now, he may have been wicked, but as honest searchers, we must default on the fact that the Torah doesn't say so, which is just one reason why one should accept this pasuk through the contextually honest interpretation of Esav not being a bad guy, which I might add anyone not interested in adding to the Torah really should accept, lest we fall into the averah of adding to the Torah. And sometimes, friends, you will notice that although there may be different ways Pesukim can be understood, the ethical always must take precedence. In other words, as it is in this case, the tribal understanding definitely takes a back seat, or should take a back seat, to the ethical one. Then someone will then say, how about the famous statement, Esav soneh leYaakov? And it even states, halacha beyadua. In other words, where it states that Esav hates Yaakov, and Here it even states that this is the understood halakha. First of all, friends, can anyone tell me where does it ever state this? Because I know that many quote this as if it was said by Chazal or if it appears in Torah itself. And the truth is that this only appears in Rashi. And although he states that he was quoting the Rashbi, the phrase is never found anywhere amongst Chazal. Not that anyone would ever consider that halakha, even if it was written by Chazal, even though we have no source for it, because it would obviously fall under Agadah, which is why many Rebbeim, including Rabbi Gil's student and Rav Yitzhak Alderstein, say that it must have been a misprint in the Rashi, assuming that even Rashi would have known the difference between halakha and Agadah. And some even state that the printers may have mistaken the Hey Lamed Aleph, which is Halo, which means, isn't it well known, with Hey Lamed, which usually translates as halakha. But I hope you're beginning to see how Midrashim and Agadot not only are very much confused with Torah, but in the case of this Rashi, could actually affect someone's ethical outlook, which is another reason one must be careful when studying Chumash via Meforshim. Because really, for our intents and purposes, one can even say Rashi may have made this up, because we have no source for it anywhere. And friends, this goes for all non-authoritative tales said about Esav. Because honestly, who knows anything more than what appears in the text? Honestly. Which, as a matter of fact, if you follow the narrative, at least according to its plain literal understanding, Esav did nothing wrong. Nothing. To the point that he was even favored by his father Yitzhak. And even later, or in the same narrative, it is Yaakov trying to appease his brother and even seems very, very remorseful while doing so. Basically for what has transpired. And the truth is that although we know that it is eventually Yaakov who ends up finding the God of Israel and not Esav, the narrative, even towards the end of their lives, does not depict Esav evil nor with evil intentions. And I know that our sages had a very different approach to this story, and the big question is why. Even going as far as to say that Yaakov studied Torah in his tent all day and even learned in yeshiva when he left his father's house. Even going as far as to say that Esav would lie to his father and bring him dog to eat instead of clean animals. And the truth is that these rabbinical folkloric embellishments ultimately hurt more than they help. How? Because it strips the narrative of any realism, anything you or I could relate to. Which is why, friends, you should not think for a second that only because an Aggadic tale appears in the Talmud or some other piece of rabbinic literature that this in some way speaks for Torah or for Judaism. Not to mention that in the same bulk of text you will find many, many times, friends, you will find contradictory stories about the same characters in the same Torah, teaching you that no one ever thought to take any of these legends literally. Well, till at least the beginning of the 13th century, when legend became Torah, and of course, when Jewish mysticism and folklore became deified and ultimately codified with the acceptance of the Zohar. To the point that, like we said, that the average Jew today makes no distinction between Midrash, Agadah, a tale or legend, with what literally appears in Torah. They'll say that it is all the same, and the way we explain contradictions is by saying Shevim Panim LaTorah, that there are 70 faces to the Torah, a saying that I must remind you is also Aggadic. In other words, friends, there's no harm in believing that there are 70 faces to the Torah, as long as every one of those faces do not deviate from the literal message that appears in those 5 books, which, granted, could many times be understood in different ways, but cannot be interpreted in the light of some later legend that is non-existent in the text. And no, friends, oral law does not include midrashim, unless, of course, it's a midrash halakha, which is then only accepted for its halachic qualities and not because there's any truth in the midrash at hand. In other words, friends, oral law contains only laws and not tales, a distinction that, again, few make today. In other words, nothing else exists to explain or expound the tales in the Torah except the words of the Torah itself. Nothing, my friends, lest we violate the mitzvah Baal Tosif of adding to the Torah, chas v'shalom. So yes, your guess is as good as theirs. In other words, it is the job of the sages, i.e. those who sat on the Sanhedrin, to only establish practical laws for us to be able to perform mitzvot in a uniform manner, and not to change the narrative of the Torah through fairy tales. Especially when it is used to paint an ugly, biblically unsupported view of the outside world, telling you that The world intrinsically is your enemy and hates you, which is why I honestly believe that every Torah commentary that does not build its conclusion off of the plain understanding of the text, or even using some drashic method, in other words, understanding the narrative in context, should be rejected by the Jewish people. And if your next question is, Rabbi Asher, how about Pardes, the mystical method of biblical interpretation? And my answer, friends, is that it's nonsense. It was actually developed post the 13th century and is not endorsed anywhere in Torah nor by Chazal. I mean, how many times does the Ramban disagree with Rashi, or other Meforshim disagree with each other for someone to then come around and teach that these rabbis cannot make mistakes? And if you bring this point down, what you will usually hear is that those rabbis are in such a high level, they can disagree, but we can't. Nice, huh? No deification, really, huh? So consider this lecture today a formal defense of Esav and all that has been baselessly written about him, to the point that even the Sifri goes as far as to say that the kiss that Esav gave Yaakov was not a kiss, but actually a bite. But you should know that this was only a minority opinion. But as you also know, when trying to justify hatred, it is usually minority opinions that are heard the most and are typically disguised as the majority. I mean, was it not cruel for Yaakov to withhold food from his starving brother or over some imaginary birthright? In other words, they would have known that his father would not have validated such a deal, especially when Esav made his decision under duress, especially when Yaakov directly disrespected his father by claiming to be Esav. And in retrospect, friends, did that supposed birthright help Yaakov in any way? Not at all, my friends. The narrative that is very clear in Torah of the life of the patriarch Yaakov is that everything he acquired, he earned on his own and on God's good grace. In other words, the birthright ultimately meant nothing. And please, friends, let's not heap the Torah and its ethics on individuals who lived before it was even received. In other words, let's not assume our patriarchs never made mistakes or assume that they secretly owned a copy of the Torah before it was even given, like many ridiculously teach today. The truth is that, according to the narrative, our father Yaakov did not know the Almighty until he found him later on in his life. And this is what the narrative alludes to. Heck, remember that the name Yaakov literally means a deceiver, to the point that we only really see his attitude change later on in his life when we see that the Almighty changes his name to Israel. So how can we then try to justify every act of deceit that Yaakov commits in his youth like a bunch of bigoted ethical morons? Why ethical morons? Because that is what it means when one assumes that the reason people are ethical is solely because they were born that way. Or in our case, in reverse. That because people were born a certain way or from a certain group of people, that individual must be ethical, no matter what they do. Teaching us, which is unfortunately what is popularly taught in the Jewish world today, that it is those with Jewish blood versus those without Jewish blood, instead of a struggle between the decent and the indecent, no matter of your genetic makeup. The age-old debate of nature versus nurture, a debate that really, according to the Peshat, does not really go too far. For example, with, let's say, Ishmael, one could say that the reason Muslims are spiritually inferior is because Yitzhak was a son of the promise, the line which the covenant would extend through. But what about the story between Yaakov and Esav? I mean, they're both sons of the covenant. Both were circumcised. And as the rabbis teach, that Edom became Rome, which, according to Chazal, is synonymous with Christianity, just as Ishmael is with Islam. In other words, if blood meant anything, how could Esav, whose grandpa was Avraham Avinu, not be considered in the covenant today when Yaakov is? Simple, because being in the covenant, what people refer to as being Jewish nowadays, has nothing to do with who your mom was, but is solely due on your behavior. Heck, even Lavan was Rivka's brother, so much for Yichus. Now, I'm no Karaite. I believe in Torah Shabbat Peh, and as I teach in my video called The Truth on Matrilineal Descent, regarding the notion that if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish, that this was a notion created by the Sanhedrin solely for legal purposes. In other words, not a notion necessarily endorsed by the Creator for whom he considers in the covenant or not. And also, this notion that Muslims today are our cousins because they are supposedly descendants of Ishmael is a solely Islamic idea. In other words, there's no source in the Jewish world that teaches that the Ishmaelites became the father of the first group that embraced Islam. And talking about midrashim, there's even a midrash that teaches that Yishmael made teshuvah, which is an idea that is not so far-fetched, mainly because it's built off the pasuk, where it states that he reunited with his brother Yitzhak to bury his father. And then, friends, we see in the 11th pasuk that it states, famously, Ki mimizrak shemesh ve'ad meva'o gadol shemi bagoyim uvchol makom muktar mugash lishmi umincha tehora ki gadol shemi bagoyim amar Adonai sevaot. For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations. And everywhere is brought up in smoke and brought for my name's sake, and it is a pure meal offering, for my name is great among the nations, says Hashem, Master of Legions. And this here is a very eye-opening statement, friends. Now, Christians usually try to use this pasuk to justify future Christians pleasing God to a greater extent than Jews previously had, which they're free to have their own interpretation. But honestly, when did Christians ever offer sacrifices to the God of Israel outside of the Holy Land? But regardless, this is telling us that the Almighty accepts, that it seems like he accepts competitor sacrifices, on how supposedly in ancient Rome there was even a statue for the unknown God, as Paul even states in the Christian Bible. And even Rashi here brings down a Gemara in Menachot, which states that it was common knowledge even back then for idolaters to acknowledge the God of Israel. It states that they would refer to him as the God of gods, giving us a glimpse of an arena not mentioned much in the theological world, which pertains to the outside world, even giving possible pagan religions the benefit of the doubt, almost ingraining the notion that intentions do matter in the service of God. That not only because you may be sacrificing to some other God, if your ethical intentions are in some way tuned in with the Almighty's will, that he will claim that praise. And if we even look at the context, it's actually comparing their service with our service. Now, in many cases, elsewhere in the prophets, when it refers to nations, it sometimes is regarding Jews living in surrounding nations. But being that Jews are prohibited from offering sacrifices to the Creator outside of the temple itself, this makes this a little difficult to believe that this is just referring to Jews in other nations. But also, one opinion brought down by Chazal here teaches that these are Jews learning the laws of temple sacrifices among the nations. But again, that really doesn't seem to be the case here. And this notion about Hashem accepting competitor sacrifices or sacrifices not performed according to Torah commands by at least people who don't know any better is really an idea that shouldn't be so difficult to believe, mainly because this was exactly what occurred before the Torah was given. Or do you believe that when Hava or Noah were offering sacrifices in Bereshit, they actually knew what they were doing or who they were offering it to? I mean, we know in retrospect, but according to the narrative, of course they didn't. And if someone will then say that they were probably Noahides offering these sacrifices, friends, you must know that it's really a myth that Noahides ever existed outside of the land, and especially a myth that they ever offered sacrifices like we see many Noahides do so today, also known as barbecues. Lest anyone assume that this is what the parak is referring to. No. And friends, I'm not in any way stating that this teaching of mine or this pasuk here is a binding or doctrinal statement that forms an actual issue, mainly because it's in the prophets and not in the Torah, but for sure it's something to think about. And I think I'll just end here today. Friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org or dordea.com. And please join us next week for the following Haftarat. Thank you.